So we were talking about the production of antibodies, and this is what is referred to as humoral mediated immunity. Okay, so the body's tumors, the body's fluids, the blood, right? So that's where the antibodies are. And so here you can see the process of one B cell being triggered by the presence of a specific antigen and then undergoing mitosis. And does anybody remember what that process is, where one B cell decides to undergo mitosis and produce many different copies of itself? Clonal expansion, right? So here is selection of the B cells and then the clonal expansion of those B cells. So what are these B cells that stay in the body long-term called? Memory B cells. And then these would be the plasma cells, and then the Y-shaped molecules are antibodies. And we're going to talk about the different types of antibodies. There's 5 different classes, and we'll talk about their specific roles in a minute. Okay. So we were talking about the difference between the primary immune response and the secondary. So primary would be when you first get exposed to a particular microbe, or it could also be to a vaccine that has a microbe in it or pieces of the microbe in it. And then the subsequent secondary response is much quicker and much faster. Okay, so the last thing that we were talking about was this idea of vaccinations. So when we talk about vaccinations, we can talk about what it is that we're providing the body with. And we can also talk about some of the possible risks and some of the controversy behind vaccines. So remember when we were looking at smallpox, what were they using for the vaccine? Scabs. So first they were using scabs. So remember, they were actually taking maybe scabs and grinding it up and then having them inhale it. You can do a vaccination through the nose. You could actually do also an injection. Sometimes they would just take the pus from a scab and rub it on a person's body, right? And that would be a possible vaccination. So what did they discover about smallpox that led to widespread vaccination from that disease? Yes. And so in this particular example, this is they called it variolation. And I think vario means that it is a different version of it, right? So you use a closely related microbe that is less mild in its effects. Or sorry, more mild. More mild, okay? So for example, for smallpox, right, they use cowpox. And they discovered this because the females would milk the cows, right? And they would develop kind of maybe a little bit illness from it, but then they would be immune to smallpox. And so that would be an example of a vaccine. You can also use inactivated microbes. So for example, lots of the flu shots, for example, could be for inactivated microbes. Also the bubonic plague. And remember that the bubonic plague affects the lymph nodes, and it is actually a bacterial infection that causes Black Death. Okay. So they would weaken, or they would inactivate the microbes by like subjecting them to X-rays or subjecting them to heat, right? And so you're giving the person the inactivated forms. They can also give them the weakened forms, and the weakened forms are called attenuated. So this is a weakened form of the microbe. So measles, mumps, and rubella, which is also called what? Rubella, I think that's the whooping cough. MMR, yeah, is that right? No, let's see. Let me see what rubella is. Rubella has a common name. It's a form of measles. Oh, right, rubella. German measles, so it's a form of German measles. So whooping cough must be a different. Pertussis, excellent, thank you. You guys, wow, that game helped, huh? Did you know that before the game?
No.
Oh, good. Learned something, okay.
And it was fun.
It was fun, yes.
Except for we all kind of wanted to beat Kaylin for getting the next one.
Yeah. We also can use what is called a toxoid, right? So sometimes the disease is actually caused by toxins that are produced by the microbes. So what's an example of this? Do you know? What's an example of a bacterial illness that is actually due to a toxin that's produced by the bacteria? You learned about this also in your game.
Allergens?
Allergens, no, it's not a toxin. What do you have to get when you step on a nail or if you get a scratched cornea? Okay, so that would be tetanus.
I don't think any of us did. She did.
Okay. Also, an example was diphtheria, another one, where it's actually the toxoid that's given. Okay. And then they can give you a subunit of the microbe, just a piece of the microbe. And so hepatitis B is an example of this, as is the human papillomavirus. Right, so that's HPV. So hepatitis B is bad because it can cause liver damage. It can lead to liver cancer. The human papillomavirus is bad because this can lead to cervical cancer. And so one of the interesting things about this virus is that it's super widespread and it's easily transmitted through sexual contact. And it's the whole reason why females, especially young females, have to get a pap smear on a regular basis in order to check for possible cancer of the cervix. So the whole pap smear is due to the name of the virus, the human papillomavirus, and it causes warts, genital warts as well. And so this one was a little bit controversial because they're asking parents to have their children vaccinated against this before they become sexually active. So like when males and females are like 11, right, you want to get them vaccinated early so that when they do start to have sexual interactions, then this virus, they'll be immune to it. And then hopefully, you know, we'll become more immune as a population and we won't have so many possible reproductive cancers, specifically in females. So those are some examples of the what we give to people as a vaccine. So when we look at some side effects, right?
I have a friend who says that she got lupus because she got the HPV vaccine.
So you may get ill. So especially if it's a weakened virus, you might get a little weak form of the illness, right? Ill with weakened pathogens. The other possible side effect is that you may have an allergic reaction. So that's always a possibility when you're putting something foreign in your body, is to have an allergic reaction to it. And so that's why they're very, very, you know, they monitor you carefully after you get a vaccine, they like, if you have trouble to breathe, for example, that could be an example of anaphylactic shock. If you pass out, your blood pressure goes too low, that could be an example of anaphylactic shock. And your example could be that some viruses, when you respond to them, it can actually cause the immune system to become hyperactive. Okay, so I might put that one down here as well. May cause immune system to be hyperactive. So we know that sometimes viruses, after a virus, and after you start to get well from it, even if you just get it naturally, you could develop, the one example that I know is Guillain-Barré or Guillain-Barré disease. And that is where the immune system starts to attack the myelin sheaths of the neurons. And so you might get a virus, and then you might start to feel better, and then all of a sudden you're paralyzed. And that's because the immune system becomes hyperactive and starts to attack normal, healthy tissue. So the one that has caused quite a bit of uproar, okay, is the fact that it may have things in it, the vaccine, other than the vaccine, that might cause problems. And so some vaccines, specifically multi-dose bottles, have a mercury-based preservative. And obviously mercury is a neurotoxin. And so the concern was that this preservative was actually causing children to possibly get diseases like autism because it was affecting their nervous system. But there's not a lot of evidence of this, and they have subsequently taken out the mercury-based preservative. So they don't use that anymore. But there was a point in time when children were getting so many vaccines so close together that perhaps that excess mercury, they thought that might have an effect on them. Okay. So those are some possible side effects. And so obviously, if you think about the huge human population as a whole, these side effects are relatively minor unless you have a massive allergic reaction, right? But from a perspective of populations, vaccinations have done an amazing kind of a miracle cure for a lot of the diseases that used to plague us and cause really, really, really bad things to happen. Yeah.
So when we're talking about these vaccines, I assume we're talking about ones like you'd kind of said, like smallpox, stuff that we
polio,
don't find,
that
we don't find very common.
Right.
But for example, like the flu shot, they advertise that like 6, 7, 8 months out of the year. And is a person supposed to get that every year? Is that the type of vaccine that like you'd go get every year? Because personally, I haven't had one since I was a really, really little kid, and I don't really know.
So the flu virus is controversial because the flu virus is a rapidly mutating virus. Mm-hmm. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to find they're trying to find that flu virus that is the worst, right? And that could possibly lead to death if you were ever exposed to it. Okay. So there was this horrible, back in 1918, there was this horrible flu epidemic that you probably see it in historical novels and in movies, where like, I think it was like 1 out of every 5 people in the United States, maybe even more. There's millions of people that died of this specific strain of flu, right? And so what we don't want is a pandemic, a flu virus that is going to just wipe out, if you can imagine, like if out of every, family member, 1 out of 5 are going to die of it, right?
Yeah.
So we haven't had one of those horrible flu viruses in, since then. But the worry is that the people with the weakened immune systems are going to be the ones that are going to be affected first. So if you are old, your immune system is weak. So old people die at a much higher rate of flu. And that if you are young, if you're a young kid, you're going to be more at risk of dying. So they specifically, if you work with the general population, like if you work at the hospital, you have to get the flu. They will not let you not get the flu vaccine. And it's not necessarily to protect you, but it's to protect the people that you work with that have a reduced immune system, and they could actually get the flu and die. Most of us are strong enough to perfectly resist the flu, you know, but it's like, I would get the flu vaccine if I didn't want to get sick and give it to any of you, right? So it's kind of like altruistic kind of thing.
Well, the part that I'm having a hard time wrapping my brain around, and that's just a small example, I guess you could say, but you know, majority of our population in the United States, without doing any further research, probably goes and gets this flu virus.
I don't think a lot of people do, actually. I don't know if that's true.
I don't get it.
If you work in the health profession, you do.
From now on.
That was terrible.
Jeez. But it's one of those that, like, I feel like if we give it so common, well, theoretically so commonly because it's so well advertised, that why isn't the common just cold and flu, you know, why aren't we immune to that by now?
Okay, so some people confuse colds, respiratory infections, and flu. Flu, if you've ever had the true flu, which I did, it affects your lungs. Like, it gets into your lungs and you get super, like, it is not just like a head cold and you feel kind of crappy, but I mean, it can take you down because you just can't even breathe, right? And so, and that's why it leads to pneumonia. So the reason why it is not, we haven't been able to find a vaccine to cure all colds and all flus is because they just rapidly mutate. And we're going to talk about, I'm going to show you a video that talks in a minute about why those types of mild, like the cold, why the mild viruses are not, they're not selected out because they don't cause death, right? And so they're actually more easily propagated because you can be, you know, instead of staying home with the cold, everybody's just walking around with it because they're not sick enough to stay home with it. And so that's why it spreads and that's why it mutates. If we all stayed home every time we felt a little bit sick, or if you were like a germaphobe and you never left your house, right, you probably wouldn't get colds very often because it's just because it's, and it's true that if you go to a different country, my sister went to Jerusalem one year and she came back puking, and like, it was so amazing. Everybody around her just like fell ill because she had brought home this weird bug, not bug, but weird microbe from Jerusalem. I'm like, why did you do that? You know, we should have quarantined her as soon as she got home, right? So yes, and so that's why it's not. Yeah. So you say that the flu flu vaccine doesn't work, but if you think about it, how many more people would die without the flu vaccine?
You know, the like bad side of it, of course, is you're like, are you know, having a conversation, you're gonna get the flu shot? No. Are you? No, because last time I got it, it made me sick the next day. So you just hear people complain of, because, you know, I think that people that aren't in this kind of area of general knowledge don't understand that you're actually literally giving yourself the illness. So that's just kind of why it's one of those that it's like, I thought more people had gotten it than didn't get it, but that's just one of those things that's like, okay, we've cured all these things. Why doesn't the flu shot just get rid of it? Yeah. So, and that's just, like I said, that's a weird, really long, super extent. So I understand that part of it, but just, you know, we're so into these vaccines and stuff. I can't tell you last time I had the chickenpox shot either. So,
well, you shouldn't have to have the chickenpox shot more than once.
Just once. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Just once.
So,
yeah.
They give you like the two most popular strains.
Yeah, they give you, yeah.
My mom said,
And the ones that are going to make you the sickest.
yeah, so she got the flu last year after getting the flu shot, but that's because she got the flu that they didn't like protect against, because they only gave you the two main ones.
That's my luck.
And she got like a lot of people got it too.
Yeah.
So it's because they just have to guess.
They have to guess. It's a guess as to which one is going to be the worst and which one is going to be the most common.
I just can't stop thinking about people snorting scabs. It disgusts me.
Well, the other option is getting smallpox. Right?
Yeah.
This is an example of the smallpox. Which is,
I think I would have rather like took a little shot of something or in my sandwich than. You know, and it's just a nice PB&J, just stick it in the middle like a piece of cheese or something.
Cheese on your
Okay.
I don't know. I don't eat cheese on my PB.
So what we have been talking about is actually active immunity, right? So when we talk about active immunity, this is where the body is exposed, and it can be exposed either by getting the disease or through a vaccination. Right, to a specific microbe and responds by producing antibodies. Okay. So vaccinations would be an example of active immunity. Now we also can take in antibodies via a passive source. And a good example of this, so passive immunity, would be receiving antibodies from another source. So a good example of this is breastfeeding. So breast milk has antibodies in it that the mother's body has produced. And so it passes on a passive immunology or passive immune system to the baby. So that when the babies are born, they have essentially very little specific immunity. And so those just help the baby, keep the baby from getting sick by common microorganisms until they can develop their own immune system. So these are short term. So short term is passive, short term, and active immunity is long term.
Is that one of the reasons why a lot of people feel like it's very important to breastfeed over using, substitutes?
It's one of the reasons, but breast milk has so many different things in it. It has enzymes, it has antibodies, but it also has important lipids that they think are important for brain function development. So what is the first type of breast milk that is produced? Colostrum. Right? And if you've ever seen colostrum doesn't even look like milk. It is yellow, right? And it's thick because it's got so many proteins in it, but it doesn't have the milk fat in it. So it's the first milk. It's called colostrum. Okay. And then the milk has antibodies in it, but it also has lots of fat in it when the milk comes in full force.
No.
Okay. So when we can get shots, right? And one example of this is gamma globulin shots. Okay, so this would be giving somebody antibodies, and this used to be really common. And in fact, for some reason, I was sick a lot as a child, but for some reason, I had to go in and get gamma globulin shots like every 2 weeks, and I'm not sure why they did this. It was kind of weird period of time. I don't know why they were doing this, but they thought it would keep me healthier. And so it used to be, and I'm not sure if it is true now, but soldiers and military people, when they go into a foreign country, they want them to have some immunity. They don't want all the troops to get over there and then just fall down ill with the flu, right? So what they do is they give them shots of antibodies, and specific antibodies to microorganisms that are in the place that they're going to, right? So those would be gamma globulin shots. So this would just contain the antibodies that have been filtered out of a person, or maybe you probably can synthetically produce them, but you can just get them from another person's blood, and then they're put into your blood. Okay. So, but that is short term, not long term. So there's no memory. So no short term, no memory.
So once you get the antibodies in there, your body won't naturally produce copies of it?
No.
No.
How do they filter the antibodies out of the blood?
They just take the blood serum. So when you look at blood serum, and there's an optional extra credit on the immune system looking at the blood serum. So this is just the fluid minus the blood cells. So it's like the plasma, and it has proteins in it, and that protein would include the antibodies. They can also take and use what are called anti-venom shots. Okay. So let's say you get bit by a rattlesnake. They have an anti-venom potion at the, not potion, but serum at the hospital, right? And so you would go there, and what that would be, that would not contain, that would not like be a vaccine at all. That would actually be the antibodies that would bind to the toxin, that's the venom that's been put into your body, and take it out of solution to cause it to precipitate out of solution. So anti-venom shots would also be passive immunity.
So if you were to get bit by a snake once, and then say just it happened, you were to get bit by one again, would your body have that?
Your body would probably be faster to respond. You might still be at different
Have you
risk.
ever heard of people that purposely have
Yeah.
their snakes or spiders bite them? Because slowly over time, your body will develop an immunity to their venom, which I think is crazy. I think it's crazy, but.
I mean, if you're gonna hang out with snakes all the time.
Yeah, if you're gonna be a rattlesnake catcher.
Yeah, I have a friend that's whole room is filled with snakes.
Yeah.
He lets his snakes bite.
Yeah. Has he ever gotten sick? Are they? No, they're not
Yeah.
really bent. They're not pit.
He had, I can't
Vipers.
remember which kind he had that was poisonous. It wasn't a rattlesnake. It was another one that
Okay.
was slightly poisonous.
Okay.
And he was letting that one bite him.
So he could develop antibodies. Yeah.
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 So
Okay.
like, is that for in case one like crawls out while he's sleeping or something?
I guess.
Or does he like train them? Because I mean that's cool, but
Yeah.
I
go to a
had-
snake show.
My mother always thought that it was good when we got stung by bees, because it was like this little boost of the immune system. You know, your immune system has to respond. It keeps your immune system active.
Well, and it's one of the, because my parents kind of did the same thing. Like they never taught us to be afraid of bees, because it's one of those incidents that you don't know you're allergic to it till, oh crap, you
Right.
just got stung by a bee. So I remember my parents too, like one would land on me and they're like, don't freak out. And one time we were just watching that dang thing did sting me. Nothing happened, so I'm not allergic to them. But I remember my parents too.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, it's okay, it won't hurt.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
No, it hurts.
So antibodies have another name, and this name is the immunoglobulins. Okay, so that is synonymous with antibodies. And so there are 5 classes of immunoglobulins. And it all starts with Ig. So immunoglobulin is abbreviated as Ig. Okay. So the way that I remember this is that it is, the mnemonic device is MADGE. So those are the 5 classes. So the first one is IgM. So IgM can be a pentamer. So that means that there are 5 Y molecules bound to one another. And when it is a pentamer, it actually acts in agglutination of red blood cells. So this is the basis for a transfusion response where your body would reject the blood of another person. So like if I'm type A and you inject me with type B blood, then I would produce antibodies that are specific to the type B antigen, And then it would cause agglutination, and I'd have a transfusion reaction, and I'd probably die because my blood vessels would clot up. Okay. It also has a single unit, so it can be singular, right? Single, and then it's very common in the primary response. Okay. So when your body first gets an infection, it's the IgM that kind of comes on the scene, right, and is produced. Okay. IgA. This is found in saliva, sweat, and breast milk. IgD is what is bound to B cells. So it is actually the receptor on the B cells. Okay, so it's IgD antibodies. IgG, this is gamma. So when you have those gamma globulin shots, this is the type of antibody that is inserted. So this is the most common type circulating in the blood. This can also cross the placenta. So it can provide passive immunity to even the fetus while it's inside the mother. Okay. And then finally, IgE, and I remember this one because of the idea of eosinophils. Remember, eosinophils are a type of leukocyte, starts with an E. And those are specifically released in response to parasites. Do you have a question? So IgE is what is produced. Oops, IgE is produced in response to parasites. Okay. So parasites, multicellular parasites. So things like nematodes and maybe tapeworms. So we do have some immune ability to fight off those parasites, even though they're relatively uncommon today in our country, at least. Okay. But also this is responsible for allergic reactions. So it is the type of antibody that binds an allergen and then causes a massive release of histamine into the body, which can cause swelling and the loss of fluid from the circulatory system. Okay, so in your book, they have pictures of these. So remember that the Y-shaped molecule, the constant region is the arm, or not the arm, but kind of the leg of the Y. And then these are the variable regions, right? So that is the variable region. So they all have the exact same base. And then the variable region is the kind that is the, or would be the arms, okay? So three-dimensionally, they look something like this. If you were to look at a picture of the different atoms that are bounded molecularly together.
So basically like in that image, the yellow and the black would be the variable?
Yeah, so this is, yes, so the yellow and the black, yeah, you're right.
Still constant.
Yeah, there's some constant. But the variable regions are on the end of the Y. Okay, so this is, I'll just show this to you. This is the pentamer. So notice how the Y molecules can form into a 5-shaped molecule, right? IgA is sometimes a dimer. We don't need to know that. IgD, IgG, and IgE. So when we talk about the mechanisms of action, there is another acronym. I don't know if they use this in your book, but I use it to remember. It's called PLAN. So this is the mechanisms by which the antibodies do their work. Okay? So first one is precipitation. So for example, an antibody can bind to a toxin and it can cause the toxin to come out of solution. Okay? So it causes antigen to come out of solution. And so therefore it can't be transported throughout the body, which could be a problem if the toxin is spreading in the body, but precipitates out, that's better. Lysis, right? So it can cause microbes like bacteria to burst, to rupture. Right? Then we have agglutination. Right? So it binds to antigens or microbes. And causes them to clump. Okay. And then sometimes it also neutralizes them. It can do more than one of these, but neutralization. Okay. Prevents antigen from doing harm. So it might prevent the bacteria from reproducing. It might prevent the viruses from infecting the cells, right? So it neutralizes them. So in your book, there's a nice diagram that shows these 4 different effects that the antibodies can have. And so it looks like this. And so this would be an example of where that IgM antibody binds to red blood cells and causes them to agglutinate. Precipitate means it comes out of solution, and it can cause it to lysis through the use of complement proteins. So it can cause, once the antibody binds to the cell membrane, it could cause those opsin complementary proteins to be put into the membrane, and then the cell will lysis. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so the antibodies, they don't actually fight them, so it's not,
No.
they send signals to other things.
Well, they do fight it because they bind to it.
Right.
Right, so here's binding to it. But the cells have to then come in and then get rid of all the leftover debris. So like if this happens, right, white blood cells would have to come in and they'd have to eat that, right?
So basically the cells don't come in and eat it until they're binded.
Yeah, so the antigens bind to tell the cells, the white blood cells like the T cells, to come in and destroy the cell. And then the macrophages come in and they eat up the debris. And then you get what is called pus, right? So pus is a leftover, and it's got cellular debris in it. And it might have dead white blood cells as well as dead regular cells. And so it comes in and cleans it up.
So once the antibodies are bound to the molecule or the virus or whatever it's binding to, how do the white blood cells or like the macrophages or the phagocytes or whatever, how do they know to come and attack?
Well, there might be other white blood cells in that vicinity.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say if there's an infection, there's other white blood cells there, and they send out what are called interleukins. And so these are chemicals that say that in the bloodstream that say that there is something here, and it attracts other white blood cells to that area. So they're probably, the antibodies wouldn't be here. The antibodies wouldn't be here unless there were some B cells already present, and then those cells can send out signals and attract other cells to the area. Yeah, so the antigens, although they do circulate, so they are in our blood at all times. So there are white blood cells that also circulate through the blood, and if they come upon a bunch of antigens, then they would send a signal and it would attract more white blood cells to that area. Yeah.
And then the interferons is just between the cells.
Between the cells.
So like once a cell.
And they're not
is
even
attacked-
white blood cells. They're just between normal, healthy body cells.
Okay.
Yeah.
So interleukins.
Okay. So we're going to talk about cell-mediated immunity, and this would be not B cells. This is T cells. These are T cells. They're called T cells because they mature in the thymus. And remember that they have to go to school in the thymus too, so you have to make sure that they can tell self from non-self. Okay. So there are different types of T cells. One is what is called TH, and this is a helper T cell. This is the type of cell that is targeted by the HIV virus specifically. So the HIV virus targets helper T cells. So just put that in HIV targets these cells. So they're slightly different than the other type of cells. You don't need to know this, but they're called CD4 cells versus CD8 because they have CD4 receptors on them, and that's why the HIV targets them, because it uses those receptors to insert its own genetic material to gain entry into the helper T cells. Okay. These function in coordinating humoral and cell-mediated immunity. And it does this by releasing signals. So it releases cytokines, and some of these cytokines are also called interleukins. So cytokines are just chemicals that are meant to be a form of communication between B cells and T cells. And interleukins is a really nice word because it means that it's between leukocytes. So it's between white blood cells, interleukins, right? And there's actually different types of interleukins. And you can actually, they use interleukins medicinally to stimulate the immune response, right? So they can give you shots of interleukins and that would stimulate the B cells and the T cells. Okay. We also have TRs. And these are regulator T cells. And one of the things that these cells can do is they can suppress the immune system. Because we want the immune system to do its job, but we don't want it to get hyperactive because that's when autoimmune diseases happen, right? So it can suppress the immune response. So keep it from just getting out of control, okay? And then we have TC, and this is cytotoxic T cells. So cyto means cell. These are the cells that actually attack cells. So these attack and destroy cells through the use of chemicals. B cells do not attack and destroy cells directly. They produce antibodies. So these specifically produce perforins. So if you think about that word, perforate, to put a hole in, right? So the perforins cause, they're like bullets, right? They just send them out and it puts holes in the bacteria, or holes in the cancer cell, or holes in the cell that's been infected with a virus. And then granzymes are released. So the granzymes are enzymes. And the enzymes digest the cell from the inside out. So they go in and they digest it. And I'll show you a picture of this in a second. So the cytotoxic T cells are the ones. Sometimes these are called killer T cells in other textbooks. When we look at the T cells in general, so this is a general, do not have antibody receptors. Okay. So what that means is that they cannot detect an antigen directly. So they have to be presented with antigens. So they must have antigens presented to them. So these are presented to them by APCs. So APCs, those are antigen presenting cells. So you saw this actually in the video that you watched on Friday. So for example, we can talk about macrophages. Right, our example. So you saw the macrophage would eat a bacteria and then would save pieces of that bacteria and then would present the bacteria to the T cell. And the T cell would then be able to recognize it and then go out and find more bacteria that have that antigen on them. Okay. Another example of an antigen presenting cell would be cells that are called dendritic cells. And dendritic cells have lots of cytoplasmic extensions, so they kind of look like a tree. So they have lots of branches. So the macrophages kind of are in our lymph nodes, they're in our body, but they're kind of aggregated at the lymph nodes. The dendritic cells are on the surface of the body. So they would be like in your epithelial tissue, in your skin, but they would also be like in the tissue that lines your respiratory tract, this tissue that lines the digestive tract. So any place that's going to be exposed to the external environment, that's where you're more likely to find the dendritic cells. So these are in your lymph nodes, for example. These would be in the surfaces that are exposed to the environment. Okay. Then we also have B cells. Okay, so B cells themselves can present antigens to the T cells. So if we look at a picture, I think I have a picture of a dendritic cell. Here. So this would be the picture of the dendritic cell. So that's why it's called that, because of all the branches coming off of it. So it too would be a type of phagocyte. Okay, so this is a little bit confusing, but the presentation of the antigens are done using MHC proteins. Okay, do you remember what MHC stands for? What does MHC stand for?
Major
Yes. So major histocompatibility proteins. So remember that these are proteins that you have in your body that allow your cells to tell self from non-self. So if you give yourself an organ transplant, your body would detect the organ because it would have different MHC proteins than yours, and it might reject it. Okay. So MHC proteins are used to present antigens. And as such, there's actually two classes. So if we look at class 1, these are found on all body cells. Oops, body cells. Okay, so there's class 1 MHC proteins. So if I were to draw a little picture of this, it might look like this. So this is my MHC protein. Okay, so this is on the surface of my body cell. okay? And say that this cell is a body cell that has become cancerous. So when the cells become cancerous, they produce different types of proteins that are not normal. And so this cell can actually present on its surface a cancer protein. So this would be my antigen, okay? So this would be a cancer type protein. Okay. So in effect, any type of body cell could present using class 1 MHC. And so this is going to be like this, the cytotoxic T cell comes upon the cell that's presenting this foreign cancer type protein, and it will put holes in it, and it will digest it, and the cell will die. So we actually believe that cancer arises very frequently in people's bodies. So all of you have had cancer cells in your body, but the immune system is so fast at detecting them that it detects and kills them before it causes a widespread tumor or metastasis of the cancer, before it causes problems. So cancer cells can cause their own destruction by and that's important, right? So you don't want to be a cancer cell and like hide the fact that you're a cancer cell. Also, if this cell is a virus, right, or virus type protein. So if this cell is infected with a virus, it presents pieces of the virus on its surface, and the C cell or the cytotoxic T cells can find that, and they can destroy it. Okay, so that's class 1. The other type is called class 2. And it is only found on immune cells. And it releases, or it detects, foreign proteins. So these foreign proteins have what are called exogenous antigens. So exogenous means it's outside generating proteins, right? Yeah, exogenous antigens means that they're from the external environment. So bacteria or viruses or toxins are all exogenous. So what do you think these ones that are produced by cancer or the virus, what is that? Does anybody know what that's called? If opposite of exogenous would be, what do you think? Endogenous, right? So these are endogenous antigens because they're produced by a person's cell themselves. So they're endogenous antigens. So this is a picture of class 1, right? So if this is any type of cell, so let's say that this is a foreign, it's a viral or a cancer protein, it gets transported to the outside and it gets stuck on that class 1 MHC, right? And then that is going to be like a flag, a signal to the immune systems that this cell is not normal and it needs to be destroyed. And then finally we have exogenous. So this would be like a macrophage. So imagine a macrophage eating a bacteria. It digests the bacteria, and this is the weird part. I don't know how this works. It separates out the pieces of it that it is going to use to signal. So it separates those out and then attaches them to the class 2 MHC. And then this is a signal to the T cells. This is a foreign protein from a microbe that is now in the body, and go out and look for it. Okay, so that's the difference between endogenous and exogenous. This would be an exogenous antigen because it's from outside of the cell.
This stuff all sounds so crazy, like our cells have brains.
I know.
It's just,
and sometimes I say they think about this, and I'm using anthropomorphic terms,
yeah,
but obviously.
And then they just talk to each other.
Yeah.
And that bacteria. It's so weird.
Yeah.
I always think that it's really not that complex, that somebody just got paid a lot of money to make up big words. I think they're all
Well, I think it's
lying.
Because when it doesn't work, then we're like, oh, like somebody, like, we'll talk about the bubble boy, right? He's got one defective gene, right? And that means that he has to stay in a bubble because he can't fight off anything. Bacteria land on his skin, he breathes in bacteria, brings in fungi, and he can't fight it off. Okay, so I didn't get to the video and I didn't get to the handout, so we'll do that on Wednesday. So I'm gonna stop there. So bring that handout back.